All right, so in this video, we're going to be looking at the factored form of a quadratic. Now, before we get to the first part of your notes, let's actually start with the middle of your notes, where it talks about the factored form of a quadratic. So this is the form that we're going to try to get it in, to be in factored form. Now, what does this all mean? What's up with this P and the Q? What do those mean? The P and the Q are just referring to the x-intercepts. Okay, so if we know what the x-intercepts are, we can put it in factored form. A, if you're wondering what's A all about, well, A is just, we will learn more about how to find out what A is, but that's going to be in what we learn about tomorrow. So don't worry too much about that, but what A tells us is if the graph opens upwards or downwards, and if there's any vertical stretches or compressions. But today we're going to focus on situations that there's no vertical stretches or shrinks or compressions. We're just looking to see, making sure we know how to get it in factored form. So if we're looking at a graph, so over here on the graph we have the graph of y equals x squared plus 2x minus 8. And notice the x-intercepts are at -4 and +2. So if we want to get this in factored form, we're just going to use the x values there for our x-intercepts. So it'd be y equals, that's still part of our equation, so don't forget about that. We already have that for us, but we want to make sure we remember to include it on our own if we need to. But it'd be y equals x, and then it's always x minus the x-intercept. So x minus -4 would become x plus 4. And x minus 2 will just remain x minus 2. If we multiply those together, we would get x squared plus 2x minus 8. And here, if we just put -4 in, this is just showing us that we would get y equals 0. If we put -4 and +2 into our equation, so that's just establishing that those are our x-intercepts, because where x is those values, y would equal 0. All right. So let's look at this next example. I want you guys to try this one on your own. So I want you guys to simply get this into in a quadratic form, and go ahead and pause the video, hit play when you're ready to check your answer. All right, so again, we can easily see that there's two x-intercepts here at 4 and at 5. So it'd be y equals x minus 4, x minus 5. By the way, another way that we could see what the a value is remember in our previous videos and lessons, we've talked about standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c. Well, the a that we have here is the same a that we would have here. So if you want to put 1 in there, you can, but remember, if it's not listed there, it's not going to be in our factored form. Or if there was a number there, whatever number's in front, we would put in front of factored form. But we're not going to worry about that yet. Okay, well, that's looking at the graph. So if we look at a graph, it's super easy to get it in factored form. But what if we're not looking at a graph and we don't have a graphing calculator? Well, we need to know how to do this by what's called factoring. So there's two different situations when we go to graph, two different scenarios. One scenario is when that a value is 1. Those are the easiest to factor. When the a value is 1, we're just going to look at these two numbers, and we're going to look at what two numbers multiply together to be 12 that add together to be 7. So you can think of, so what are two factors of 12 that would add up to be 7? Well, the factors of 12 are 1 and 12, 2 and 6, and 3 and 4. Well, hopefully you came up with 3 and 4. I always like to write it down just to make sure, yep, 3 times 4 is 12, and 3 plus 4 is 7. Guess what? You just found the factored form. It's a +3, it's a +7. We're not saying that 3 and 4, I'm sorry, 3 and 4, not 7. We're not saying that 3 and 4 are zeros. We're saying that those are the factors that would add up to be, factors of 12 that would add up to be 7. So now if we wanted to find our zeros, there's something that we would do, which we'll talk about in our next video tomorrow. But this would be the factored form. And our a value is 1, so you can see that our a value is 1 still here. So why don't you guys try this next one on your own? So pause it and hit play when you're ready to check to see if you've done it correctly. By the next one, I mean the x squared minus 6x plus 8. All right, so hopefully you pause the video and had a chance to try this one on your own. We're trying to find two numbers that multiply together to be 8. Same two numbers that add together to be a negative 6. So if you have two numbers that multiply together to be a positive 8, and they add together to be a negative 6, what does that mean? Well, that means that they both have to be negative. Because negative 2 times negative 4 would be a positive 8, and negative 2 plus a negative 4 would be a negative 6. So negative 2 and negative 4 is what we put in there. Again, we're not looking at a graph. These are not the zeros, so it's not like we were doing in the previous examples where we looked at the graph. These are just simply figuring out what those values would be. Tomorrow, in the next video, we're going to learn how to find the zeros for the graph based on this factored form. But for right now, we're just getting it into factored form. All right, but now notice a difference between the examples we just did and the next two examples. The difference here is that we have an a value that isn't 1. Our first step to factoring is always look for a greatest common factor first. But there is none. Okay, there isn't a number that goes into 3, 7, and 2 evenly. If there was, we would factor that out. Okay, so then we go to step 2. Step 2 is this. Here's the way I want you to approach it. I want you to circle the first and last term. And here's why. We're going to take and multiply those two together. So, and we're going to write that over here. So 3x squared times 2, that's 6x squared. And then take that middle term, the negative 7x that we didn't circle, put that over here as well. So now we're going to do the same thing. We're going to look for what are factors of 6x squared, a positive 6x squared, that add together to be negative 7x. So it's kind of like the previous one. So they multiply together to be a positive, add together to be a negative. That means they both have to be negative. So let's try negative 1 and negative 6. Now I'm putting the x in here for a reason, because negative x times negative 6x would be a positive 6x squared. And a negative 1x plus a negative 6x would be a negative 7x. So here's why we circled those first two terms. We're going to still write those down. That's why I circled them. But that negative 7x, we're going to replace with what we just found, the minus x and the minus 6x. Okay, now this looks weird, but don't panic. What we're going to do is we're going to group these together by the first two terms and the last two terms. Now in those first two terms, now we're going to look for the greatest common factor again. And the greatest common factor between those two would be x. Now look at what happened. When I factor an x out, it's like dividing. It is dividing. We're undoing the distributive property. So 3x squared, if I divide that by x, or if I factor out an x, I'm left with just a 3x. Now with this x that we have here, when I factor out an x, I'm not left with nothing, I'm left with 1, because x divided by x would be 1. So make sure you don't make the mistake of thinking it's 0. It's not 0. X divided by x would just leave us with 1. Now when I go to the next set, it's important, because whatever we have, whatever sign we have there, we have to factor that out. Okay, so that's the only trick to this, or one of the only tricks. And now between 6 and 2, find the greatest common factor is just 2. So we're going to factor out a negative 2. Now negative 6 divided by negative 2 is a positive 3. 2 divided by negative 2 is a negative 1. All right, now look at what we have in parentheses. It's the same thing. We have 3x minus 1 in one set, 3x minus 1 in the other set. So that tells us what one of the factors are. One of the factors is 3x minus 1. So don't write it down twice. We only write it down once. And what we have here gives us the other factor. So what's outside of there is x minus 2. That gives us our other factor. So that would be the factored form. Now, if you feel like you're ready to try out one on your own, you can, but I really don't expect you to be able to do this next one on your own. So let's do this one together again. But if you want, you can pause the video. But otherwise, let's go through this one. So again, there's no greatest common factor, so we're going to skip that first step. So now we're going to look at, remember what we do next is we circle the first and last term, and we multiply those together. So this would be negative 6x squared. And then also write down the middle term, negative 5x. So we're trying to find two numbers that multiply together to be a negative 6x squared, that add together to be a negative 5x. Can you figure that out on your own? Well, let's see. Did you come up with negative 6x and a positive x? Let's try that. Negative 6x times 1x is negative 6x squared. Negative 6x plus x is negative 5x. So sometimes it takes a little messing around, but eventually you get to it. So let's bring down the 2x squared and the negative 3. And in the middle, let's replace the negative 5x with negative 6x plus x. All right, let's group the first two terms and the last two terms together. So in the first two terms, I see that I can factor out a 2 and an x. So that leaves me with x at the beginning, because 2 divided by 2 is 1. Factor out an x from x squared, and I'm left with just x. In the next term, negative 6 divided by 2 is negative 3. If I factor out an x, the x is gone. So it'll be x minus 3 in parentheses. Remember what I said, whatever sign we have there, we have to bring it down. And between x and 3, there is no GCF. Well, if there's not a greatest common factor, we can always factor at least 1. And then what's inside of there stays the same. So, inside of parentheses, we have x minus 3. Outside of the parentheses, we have 2x plus 1. So that would be the factored form. All right, so that's enough for this video. So the key here is to make sure that you know how to factor. That is the hardest part of this lesson. So I want you guys to jump now into your assignment so you can get some practice with that. And good luck as you work on your assignment.